for you this particular day. Now, what is not a nightmare is the discussion that we're going to have. Gearing up for the NAM Summit 2024, NAM being the non-aligned movement. The non-aligned movement, for those that have a good reading of history, is the standard practice that was the case more than 40 years ago at the height of the Cold War, when nations across the globe wanted not to be seen to side with either the United States or Russia during the proxy wars and everything that came with the diplomatic endgame at the time. Now, the shifting plates within the global geopolitical landscape have conditioned a new set of alignment where you must be seen to have a foot somewhere but not the whole of it. And that is where the strategic game is. Joining me for this very insightful discussion in the studio is Jacqueline Nakaiza, a political scientist. Many thanks for making time.
Thank you.
And many thanks for making time too. Feta Simon, a researcher and geopolitical analyst. When I was attending a media briefing that was called by the Honorable, is she Honorable? No, Lucy Nachobe, the head of public service, who is the top honcho for the organizing committee of the NAM Summit. We were taken through the dynamics of why Uganda must look at this particular summit as a timely event, one that offers the nation an opportunity to put itself at the forefront, especially when it comes to driving agenda of the global south. I won't say how words are as juicy as they sound, because the dynamics of global politics is that the things work for you at the time they are working for somebody else who is a superpower. So until, or if you can only maintain the fact that they work for the superpower, then things can work for you. The moment there is a change, please, you can see what can happen. The West African coups are things that give us some light into what is happening. But before we go into the nitty-gritty, I just want to have an understanding of where we stand in terms of non-alignment. And if you don't mind, let me begin with Jacqueline Nakaiza. I still maintain the ladies first, despite the fact that we have a king now.
No, that's okay.
Thank you very much, and good morning, our viewers. Talking about NAM and where we stand in when it comes to non-alignment, I think that is something which is quite complex. Okay. Being non-aligned in this day and age is I don't know how practical it is. The world has moved from unipolarity, then bipolarity, and now we are going into a world where we have multipolar powers pulling strings. You have Russia, you have the growing influence of China, which is increasingly coming down to the global south. One, to kind of promote their technological growth, but also to support our countries in terms of infrastructure development and economic growth. Then, of course, we have the US, which has always been the key player or the superpower for many years. And then we see the growing influence of Russia and how it is playing out in terms of looking at how Russia is influencing the geopolitics and conflicts around the world. So saying that a country is non-aligned is kind of a fallacy. I don't think it's really possible. Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah, in some ways, history will not be forgotten because the non-aligned choreographer of the world really comes from the great powers themselves. I said that because of four angles. One, there was the angle of military operations vis-a-vis security interests of the great powers. But two, there was the interest of politics vis-a-vis diplomacy in the geopolitical arrangements across the world. But also three, there was the interest of economics and development. And I think the current theme that Uganda is holding on to is the third strand of economics and development. But the fourth strand, which is the idea of culture and the status quo of sovereignty of states. But importantly, in these frames, you find that the great powers pivoted a higher advantage on how do we create a table that we can dominate, and then invite people as and when there is something useful. And so to that cause, you find that even in the UN gathering, you have this group, the G77, which is highly often mentioned. They are disenfranchised because they cannot raise their concerns so clearly on the table. And so that grouping has kept evolving on different issues, but narrowed to only one dimension of the four strands I've mentioned here. But here we are, 2023. But the whips, I will call them whips because it is a foreign policy whip. You either have it or you don't have it.
Yeah.
And so for many of the African countries, their consolidated foreign policy to contend with Russia, to contend with the United States, it is something which we have to carefully weave and reimagine that we can offer the alternative.
Okay.
Yeah.
You talk about something that is very pertinent, offering an alternative to the new global dispensation. Let me first shelve that and allow Ms. Nakaiza to submit what appears to be a response to what you've said. Do you want to react?
And maybe I would also say that talking about we as African countries, Uganda inclusive, we all have our own different interests, even when you're talking about groupings and what. So when we go to the non-aligned movement and saying that maybe we are strategically aligned with Russia for a certain, maybe to get some form of military technology and support. Then you're looking at China for economic development and infrastructure development in your country. Then also maybe to attract cheap loans, which you may be to attract from the West. And then you're also looking at Russia. So we really have our own interests, and you find ourselves that we are allying with almost everyone. So it's not like we are neutral.
Okay.
Yeah.
Interesting there. When you look at the groups, or rather the group of 77, there are nations within that are actually on the other side when it comes to the development stage. Indonesia has statistics that could sometimes lead us to believe that we look like them. But when you go down to the nitty-gritty, their per capita and all these development indexes, they are far higher. The same applies for China. The same applies for Brazil. The same applies for South Africa, despite the fact there is a tendency to come into our fold when it comes to the quality of life, especially for a certain section of the population. What I want to understand right now, what are the forces acting on the global South that condition the need to redefine non-alignment? Is it a case of wanting to trade better or being given access to markets in the West? Is it a case of being able to twist the arms, if that is even possible, of the powers that be in how they align their own trade interests towards us? Because at the end of the day, we must be seen to have a clear path on why we want to be a bloc that should be taken seriously by the powers that be. How is that? What is the strategic thrust for the global South?
There are many angles for the global South, and I think the South-South cooperation is one end, but particularly for the African continent, the one strand which I think sticks out is the long waiting prospect of a united Africa, which is the Pan-African ideology. And that movement is still ongoing because it's incomplete in as far as we read Du Bois and Marcus Garvey in the history of this context, because they saw a united entity as a people, because you find that when you have the Orientals, I mean Europeans and Americans, and the Orientals are one in purpose, and the one purpose because there was the fought in the 1700s, 1900s, and even in 20th century, made them to say, no, let's stop fighting, let's change the style of how we design ourselves. And
how we deal with each other,
and focus on priorities that can make us to restore our broken territories in terms of infrastructure, politics, governance, economics, and all that type of thing. And so they form some of these prior dimensions of how to make business, how to improve the value chains, how to market and make capitalism work for them much more, and so benefiting to the industrial revolution that was happening in Europe. But to your point, Asia is a pivot because Asia was a battleground for most of the wars, Vietnam War and the Burma War, where most of African countries went to. And we learned from that type of space in a very unique way. And so the tension that African countries found themselves in was when they began to speak as people who wanted to be independent. That became another voice. Why do you seek independence? That voicing of independence became a voicing of antagonism. Either now, to go, if we give you independence, what do we get from it? Because we have been that territory. This is our plantation, or where we've been harvesting. And so shifting those goalposts have been a nightmare in some ways. But for the battlegrounds where the wars have been fought, there have been nations in Asia, for example, who had opportunity to negotiate with America and Europe in a way that the advantages to them, that the responsibility to reconstruct after war was eminent for some of the people. So they developed faster because there was a covenant and responsibility for those who threw the bombs to reconstruct after the war.
That's right.
Which is not the case for many of us in Africa, even when we receive weapons and armaments from these countries. But after the war is a complex scenario. Still, we have to negotiate in terms of covenanting.
Okay.
Yeah.
Yeah, I think talking about Pan-Africanism and the whole idea of African unity would be a great thing. But realistically, it seems like this is something that we are very far from achieving, because every country wants to maintain its sovereignty. Yeah, and even when you're talking about African unity, the political, talking about the political union, the economic union, you really see that even the West and the North doesn't support us. I think they would rather have a disunited Africa than having one strong force. And remember, Africa has an advantage that we produce the key resources that sustain life, even for the West. We are producing, the West is producing technology and maybe entertainment. Yes, we are producing the minerals, the food, and all these other resources that sustain life. But then they can't have us as one united voice. And yeah, even when we come into these conferences and forums, you're negotiating as the African Union, but they're also on the sidelines talking to every individual country. So yeah. And
that's where the confusion comes in. For example, right now, when you look at the continent, South Africa has a voice of its own, and it most of the time loves to side or be seen. It wants to be seen to be a country that sits alongside India, Brazil in its negotiations with the world. Now, it will be very difficult for South Africa to agree to an arrangement where it is brought back to what could be a lesser bargaining space than where it already is, and that creates a bit of an outpost when it comes to non-alignment. And then you have a new push that we see in Kenya. William Ruto, one would say there is a bit of perhaps misguided enthusiasm on the diplomatic front. He's pushing for a new financial architecture that is designed to deal with Africa's perennial problems, debt. And he thinks if we push on that front, then there we are. And then we have President Museveni and Uganda, where the Pan-African agenda is big. Economic integration is the next big thing. He sees it as the only thing that can allow us to use the markets that we have in order not to depend on the West. So there is a lot of, everyone is trying to push what they think is best for them. How do you get that collective voice that harmonizes every country's agenda into one grand strategy to appear, well, like the word says, non-aligned, but still relevant and having a voice that will be heard by the likes of Biden and the UK Prime Minister?
I think I will want to admonish the wisdom of President Museveni, because he mentions the aspect of having to shift the center of gravity. Now, that in itself is a big weight. In how do you shift it? When do you shift it? And that shifting is only calibrated best in ideological construction.
Okay.
And
that's why he's big on ideology.
And the ideological construction is multi-layered, and it has to be trickled through many layers of the stakeholders, the citizens, the heads of states, all these dimensions. That even in the school systems across the continent, that we need to be schooled about our ownership as African people, our belonging as African people, but also our community as African people. Those tenets of uniqueness give a niche in framing the ideology, and then through the ideology you can tag in the aspects of how do you package it. And one of the ways of packaging it is owning your data about yourself. But if other people own you that about yourself, it becomes very difficult to trickle down and communicate what you want to communicate and withhold what you want to withhold. And the state secrets or the state secrecy becomes a very interesting aspect to look into in those frames. But ideology is a very, very useful entry point for us. And I hope that when NAM meeting takes place in Kampala, the heads of states will ask about what ideology our states are promoting.
Is it an opportunity to consolidate a position on each country's strategic objectives? Is it even possible?
I think this, I think this should have been. It should have been a work in progress, because I think since around maybe 2019, Uganda has known that there will be, we shall be hosting NAM, this particular conference, and maybe there should have been some kind of effort to try and come up with a common position as the East African region, and then maybe as Africa as we go into this. But unfortunately, maybe we have a lot of competing interests and priorities that our foreign policies, we really tend to push as we get closer than having a sustained, maybe even if it was slow but sustained and ongoing effort to try and come up with a common position and an agenda. And when he talks about ideology, it would be great to have our ideology as Africans. But then at the end of the day, who is even influencing the curriculum that we have in our schools? That is something we really have to rethink and say that what position, what lenses are we taking as Africans? But then the curriculum we have right now, which was passed on to us by the colonialists, and which they continue to do, because even when we're talking about curriculum reviews and what it is, the West that says that no, this curriculum that you've been working with hasn't worked, and maybe we should review and take this new angle, new direction, and that through that they continue to colonize us, and sometimes Feta talks about decolonizing knowledge. Maybe you should also talk about decolonizing ideology. Yes. Okay, but we still have that ideology. It's not our ideology. The West wants us to see our life and everything through a particular angle, and they push for that.
In other words, the grave danger is that non-aligned movement agenda could very much be diplomatic posturing.
True. That's one angle of it. Like I said in the beginning, the crafting of it is, okay, let's meet. I was reminded about, for example, in 1919, when the war was ending, and in Paris, the people are gathering. But the rest of the African peoples in Europe, in Latin America, and in America and other parts, they were not in the table 1919 at all. But Du Bois and Marcus Garvey sat in an opposite room. What do we talk about ourselves? Where we're not talking about. And I think this is an opportunity to say we have a very important idea of thinking about who we are. And when that is not consolidated properly, it becomes a very big challenge. And so, but in that framing, the foreign policy of the Orientals have crafted a new framing of this is the developing world, this is the underdeveloped world, which is not really our case. That's a caricature which I think is not who we are. If you look at who we are in terms of what we have, we are far better than what they say we are.
Interesting that immediately after the Non-Aligned Movement summit, there will be another summit.
Yeah.
The one that is being described as the third South Summit. And that one will again have to deal with issues of the South without necessarily caring what the West is doing. But again, within the dynamics of international diplomacy, you cannot discuss anything without caring what other people are saying in Washington and in London. So is the Non-Aligned Movement a platform to push for our interests, or it is a reaction in order to deal with what Africa and these other nations are having to contend with in terms of what the West pushes on them? For example, there is a long-standing concern about the United Nations and the fact that many African countries and those from the global South don't have a say. When you look at the workings, for example, of the Security Council itself, to be a decision maker as a Security Council, you need to have a threshold of technological development, the ability to do things if you are required to do things. Now, how can you want to be a decision maker when you can't even decide on security matters in terms of your ability to either defend yourself or come up with a pact that ensures defense of others? Because that is the premise of the Security Council. Whoever has the arms decides who can fight and who won't fight.
Yeah. I think for me, I will take a different twist to that big global debate.
Okay.
For example, within the continent, I know that the security people have a common space. For example, in East Africa, there's a common center where they all go and train. Okay. But when they come out of that training and they go to the countries, they seem to operate on different ideologies and mechanism. And if you're to have a united force in the region and a united force in the continent, that means the priority of how you train the military force, for example, or the police force, any other security forces, there's a unity in purpose and intent is a long mile achieved in some way. But to your point about the Security Council, it's a demand, even one of the resolutions in the previous summit, that for the African persons, then there be a clear seat. The Security Council can open it, give a chair and the seat, but they have no powers on having a veto in the space there. But China, for example, is a member in the Security Council, has a veto power in some way, but consistently does its opposite things on its own independently. A voice that I think we are learning from as members in the described non-aligned category. And I think that the description for me is not our description. It's a description coming from either the Oriental or most likely the Oriental. That these are the people who are non-aligned more than I'm saying that I'm non-aligned. Although the actions taken based on the resolutions put on the floor speak to either one, are you voting for what we have put on the table? Because they're pen holders. And the pen holders dictate what must be on the floor. And if you're not introducing the agenda or inciting the agenda, then that puts you in a very, very awkward position. And so the question of non-alignment is whether the pen holder is saying, are you with us or not with us? Not that we are saying we are not. No, it's already determined. It's
already determined. So is there a chance for reform as a result of a pressure from a set of countries coming together and agreeing that we must act and put pressure on the West in order to condition the reforms?
Talking about reform or non-reforming is we need to talk about it, but then is it effective reforms? I mean, if we've put that concerted pressure and the African Union is granted a seat, but are you going to be in position to make decisions? Because even when we have the African Union and whatever it does, it's not us who are funding ourselves. We are relying on funding from the West. So, and that makes it very, very complex, If you cannot fund your decisions. Of course, the African Union is going to make a decision, and after making the decision, you go to the European Union and you're like, we've decided this, but we need you to fund us. And then at the end of the day, you're going to ask a question, is it our decision or it is the European Union, which is at the end of the day making the decision?
So the non-aligned movement, new dispensation, can't offer any bargaining power for any effective decision-making that favors the global South?
In the current status quo, that's a tall order.
It's a tall order.
But in the current opportunity, there's a room to ask how do we better solidify the gaps we have. For example, in the recent concluded meeting for the ESC, the conversation of you must pay your dues and the like. But I asked myself, and President Ruto is saying no, we make our own currency. Good enough, but just teach yourself, if the East African peoples begin to pay each other with the resources they have, the gold they have, the oil they have, pay each other using that currency. Okay. That's a twist in the game of how you view and value yourself, because you are giving to yourself what you have. And as that continues, then the conversation expands. So how are you managing to grow this much? But if you pay yourself in dollars, in shillings, and the currency where it's printed from is not in your territory, that speaks another dynamics of a very twisted ownership.
Interesting discussion there. Let me return to exactly what this means for Uganda, away from the dynamics of the global stage. We were told during the media briefing that a staggering 90 billion Uganda shillings is going into organizing this event. We were told that the Chinese government has offered some cars to help us chauffeur some of the guests.
That shows you the plus China.
Plus China.
Yeah, and the growing influence of China.
Yeah, and we were told that service providers have been urged to ready themselves for another kill. Service providers being the hospitality industry, the food industry, and many others that, of course, do gain from such conferences. So the economic dividend for the small economy of Kampala and Uganda is there for us to. But is it what we should be looking out for?
As a state, it is an honor in the international space
to host,
to be a host. Even as a very ordinary person, when you host a guest, it's an honor. Yeah. Whether small or big volume.
You organize the
definitely
house.
You kill a chicken, clear the ground, the grass, and make everything look as if it is the one that prepared for you.
That's right.
And indeed, when guests come, they will appreciate that. Then you give them time and space and honor, and you fund them irrespective of your lack or inability in certain aspects.
It also creates the conditions for your visit to them. They will know this man treated us well. It's incumbent upon us to treat them well.
And so, for me, in the you said 90 billion, that amount of money is good to organize, because this is a big event. But for Uganda,
did I say dollars? I said shillings.
Shillings, I think.
Yeah, it's shillings, not dollars.
Shillings, okay.
That would be more.
All right, shillings, corrected. Yeah. But the interest for me, I hope that Uganda will be able to sit down with each of the countries coming here and interest them to be present with embassies or consuls within Uganda, but also lobby and negotiate in a framework of how do we reciprocate and go to where they are, and expand the scope of how to belong as people.
Okay. Yeah, but this is something that we should have started working on way back. Yeah, and also talking about hosting us and having visitors, having that economic catch from our business community. Yeah. I sometimes interact with the business community, people in the hotel industry, people in the tourism industry, but this is something that they're just getting to know. Okay. Yeah, it's not that they've known in the last 1 year to get themselves ready. Of course, they may catch in, but then it won't be as it would have been if we're prepared. Yeah, our governance is, the system is, you manage, something comes up and then you begin rushing, that last minute fixing, which is a problem. You know, at the end of the day, you don't get the actual value that you would have got if had you planned everything in time?
All right, Jacqueline Nakaiza and Feta Simon, many thanks. Let's go for a break. When we return, we shall continue this discussion and specifically look at the dimensions of international cooperation and multilateralism. Why should we be afraid to be seen to support Russia, for example? Why should we be seen not to want to say we are taking in everything the United States says as it says it? Is it a case of posturing, or is it a case that many Ugandans ought to know the workings of the global diplomatic space? Stay with us. Morning at 10 TV still. Welcome back. We're glad you're still with us here on Morning at 10 TV. We are discussing the upcoming Non-Aligned Movement Summit that is due in January 2024. What does it mean for Uganda hosting what is being described by the government as an iconic event? 122 countries of the global south plus China will be meeting and discussing how to deal with the problems and the challenges of the global economy. Whether we still are in a time that we should be seen to be on one side and not the other is also up for debate. Allow me return to the studio where I have my guests, Jacqueline Nakaiza, a political scientist, as well as Feta Simon, a researcher and geopolitical thinker. Gentlemen and lady, we had gone into the cost of this particular summit for Uganda, but I don't want to go into weighing whether we should meet the cost or not. At the end of the day, on the global stage, to host an international conference is part of the business. You cannot be seen to speak if you cannot host and be a good, give the guests and other countries some real good feel of what you are as a people and what you offer in terms of leadership. The mere fact that Uganda will be taking up leadership of these two particular movements, that is the non-aligned movement and then the South Summit, is telling of exactly why we should pay attention on the hosting of this particular summit. But allow me go on to the non-aligned aspects of global politics and the economy. Ukraine and Russia have of recent become a convenient stick to hold when African governments are explaining why certain things are not going the way they are. Some ministers will conveniently tell you, we are grappling with this because of Ukraine and Russia. We are doing this because Ukraine and Russia has distorted the way we're supposed to do this. In other words, nations that are seeking non-alignment are heavily dependent on what is happening to those they want to seek non-alignment from. Russia's position right now is not aggressive. Many times people do not see Russia on the economic front. When security matters come up, Russia in Africa is talked about, but its footprint in development aid is not as pronounced as any other country. So many times to be seen to be on Russia's side doesn't work for diplomatic posturing. But Ukraine and Russia has offered countries in the global south a challenge, okay? And it's a big one. What do you make of this particular state of affairs? Let me begin with Nakaiza.
It's quite interesting that, of course, the war is in between Ukraine and Russia, and it is not on the African soil. But when this war started, a lot of funding that used to come to Africa in terms of foreign aid, in terms of even the projects that used to come to Africa, that funding had to be rediverted. I remember I was talking to someone in Lisbon. That was around, I think it was June this year, and this person told me that we always thought that wars are far away in Africa until when it came to Ukraine, and then you see that Ukraine is channeling out a huge number of refugees in Europe, and then it becomes a serious problem. So Europe and the West have to redirect their funding and priorities from Africa to kind of counter the problem in Ukraine, and that highly affects African countries, and that is why you hear countries talking of the problem in Ukraine and Russia affecting us. Because it's, global funding has to be redirected to counter the problem in Russia. And now, it's not only Russia and Ukraine, you also have Israel and Palestine. And that also affects us.
Interesting. It's an overlap that we can see in so many aspects of our economic lives.
That's true. But also, I think Russia is an interesting phenomenon just to talk about. But in this NAM conundrum, I think the important thing is how the Western European powers have positioned themselves to portray and communicate what it is about Russia that they fear or they're afraid about. And one of the important things in foreign policy is the management or mismanagement or manipulation of data about anybody, about any space, country. About any country, and how you use it to your advantage, and how you use it to leverage the dynamics that involve. But importantly, you find that the creation of the Middle East battlefront against Russia creates a new space on how we see Russia looking like withdrawn, but not withdrawn, because they focused on consolidating the internal strength as a country, and that the internal strength to yield enough to rebuttal the opposition or the forces coming from outside. And so in aligning yourself in foreign policy, like I said earlier in the beginning, you either militarily secure or your military strength and your security operations. That is one space where Russia has not gone blind. And you can tell that how they relate with countries across the world is amazing in those areas. But also, too, in the politics, but also in the diplomatic front, that area, they have not gone amiss. While the Europeans and others wave the dollar and wave the euros in the face, and hide the other dimensions as a cognito, you find that to say that Russia is not openly coming out, I will not say so. I think they are the best diplomats I can tell about in the world. Okay,
they're working underground.
Not underground. They're working either underground or overtly or covertly, but they're diplomatic.
Okay, so to be seen to be in Russia's good graces is not something that many African governments are comfortable with. They want to play the part where they are seen as not really responding to the strands that Russia may be pulling in its own clandestine way, but still benefit from Russia, because at the end of the day, when you look at the security posture of many African countries, the arms come from Russia, and that hasn't been a problem for the West up until 10 years ago. And that shift must have been informed by the fact that Russia began to offer security help, but also begin to discuss some economic interest on its part. And that is when the discomfort began to come in for the West. And were you able to notice that pattern?
Yeah, and that point you raise is the framing of how you aligned. So are you aligned to the West or aligned to the East? A move to the left or a move to the right. And so, but no, we're neither left nor right. But we're neutral. So that conversation of neutrality it squeezes you away from what you want to say, who you are.
But that's a problem.
Yeah, but in this space of the international politics, you find that the dominant space is the East or the West, because they control these economic systems or world economic systems. And so those who find themselves in between are stretching out a hand of help to stamp on the stage that they can be able to run better. And that's where we are. And that's what, so do you align yourself or not align yourself?
What is the value of neutrality in this age?
Well, I think it's the value of neutrality is complex because we all, as states, we all have needs. We all have needs, and Russia has its leverage, the US has its leverage, China has its leverage. So, I mean, where do you find yourself? You can't, you try and get this economic gain from Russia, I mean the military gain from Russia, then you want to gain from economically from the US and then from China.
But also to that point, the point of neutrality is only valid and tied to the idea of what is called sovereignty, that you will not interfere in the internal politics and governance of a country.
Of another country.
And the only surety you find there is the concept of sovereignty, that you are sovereign, and so we will not interfere with your internal dynamics. And for that reason, then neutrality becomes a very viable term to use as a way to describe that no, you are not intending to jeopardize anything that you're deciding internally with your country as a people. But when you shift the dynamics, we have known that countries have been able to ride above the tide and condition or influence to change the dynamics. Like even right now, even as we talk about Kampala, you'll be surprised how the other countries in the G7, the G5 are working through to ensure where is our interest in this non-aligned movement.
All right, the dynamics are many, and sometimes keeping a grip to them can be a bit of a problem. But let me ask the question: when you look at recent happenings in West Africa, the military coups and what appears to be a deliberate effort by some of these leaders to want to change the economic landscape of these countries, it has affected the way France has now to deal with Africa. Could it strengthen non-alignment, or could it actually instead throw the spanner into the works somehow? Jacqueline?
Well, the recent developments in West Africa are also complex in a way, because you don't have a clear pathway to on how you're going to be addressing them. Of course, France is already unsettled. You remember, France controls not only most of French West Africa and controls their economies through they call it the French franc. They are all using the French francs, and which money is minted in France itself, and this has increasingly weakened France's power in terms of foreign policy. But then we also see it coming down from West Africa and coming down to what? To sub-Saharan Africa. We see France increasingly trying to establish itself maybe in the Horn of Africa, and also coming to renegotiate France's position in sub-Saharan Africa. But then the coups in West Africa and this whole discussion of democracy, who is supporting the coups, you can't have a coup without foreign support. Do we see the US supporting these generals to do the coups? Who is really pushing for the coups in West Africa? And who is it that is trying to unsettle the French influence?
Are you suggesting the CIA is still very rampant as it was, especially at the Cold War era?
I may not have evidence, but yes, I can't say that. I mean, it's widespread. It's widespread. Yeah, someone should be able to look into that.
Okay. Is it something that we should pay attention to? Could it lead to a shifting of the tectonic plates in global diplomacy?
I think the leaders, I'll call them leaders, the leaders in the, particularly the allied leaders, allied particularly in the security forces, in the sense that they are tuning themselves to rethink about who they are, even amidst being surrounded by a complex scenario, and starting out to begin to claim your identity and say, no, we are going to be this. And I think they bring out a regeneration of Pan-Africanism in their efforts to reassert and educate and say, look, our governance has been taken away from our plate. And so we want to restore that by owning our land, our water, our air above our space, and the space above the air, and everything else. Let's change the covenanting system, the agreements that were covenanted against us. That action alone, if every head of state in Africa just took that decision to renegotiate or to change the covenants they entered into, that they found entered into, and bring back the people of the countries they're in. I said, no, we put back our countries and align for all the countries Africa. We restore our ownership, but the covenants we put across. That's a game changer. But the second point, it is to the land friends. The land friends should prioritize in some way how to think legislation from an African lens. Without that, it is going to prolong some of our inconveniences. All
right, as we enter the final bend of this discussion, we shouldn't be remiss of the fact that there are so many benefits that, of course, Uganda stands to achieve by being chair of these particular conferences and movements. Let's stick to the non-aligned movement and leave the South Summit out of it for now. When Uganda assumes chairmanship, what is our push going to be in terms of foreign policy? What advantages does holding the chairmanship of the non-aligned movement offer Chris Higeni and any other person out there? Why should I care that Uganda holds the chair of the non-aligned movement for the number of years that we shall be holding it?
Well, I think Uganda being the chair for the next 3 years would have given us an advantage, of course, to promote our foreign policy. And the key aspects of our foreign policy.
That's very good.
Yeah, we are looking at directing for attracting foreign investors. Yeah, we're looking at regional cooperation and regional integration. You're looking at attracting tourism or promoting tourism of the country and strategically repositioning yourself as a country. So those could have been the key benefits, you know, promoting our foreign policy, because you're going to be dealing with all these countries. But then the question is, are we ready for that as a country? Are we ready to push the foreign policy?
Why do you think we are not ready?
I can tell from just the panic and the last minute fixes we are even trying to do in terms of hosting itself, because Uganda's being chair could have come with short-term benefits, mid-term benefits, but also long-term benefits. But in the short term, I realize that most likely we may gain, yes, but we may not gain as much as we would have gained had we started planning 4 or 5 years earlier. You know, if we had CHOGM in 2007, if we had done that strategic infrastructure development for CHOGM, maybe we would still be using the same infrastructure. Yes, it would help. Looking now, we are trying to fix the roads around Kampala, you know, and are we going to be ready in the next 2 months to fix roads that are going to last for the next 20 years? You know, so we
in a festive season, where public servants are off,
you know, yeah, the roads are not ready. We haven't even taken that concerted effort of maybe beautifying the city in terms of maybe planting more trees, you know, and making it beautiful. Look at Rwanda. I think it was around, of course it is a very, very hilly country, and they plant trees to kind of curb soil erosion. But then when you go to Rwanda, there is this fresh breath of life, of freshness, of, you know, it's a beautiful country. But what has Uganda done to, you know, to benefit in the short term? Of course, you're beautifying the city for the visitors, but also something that is going to do what? To last long. If we had planted trees 4 years ago with 4 seasons of rain, those trees would be green and beautiful, really. So the face of it, are we ready? So looking at the short term, the mid term, and then the long term, yeah, I think we haven't really.
Simon Feta, in 60 broadcasting seconds, wrap it up.
I think that Uganda has a golden opportunity to re-image itself in the international space. And I know that President Museveni has had a unique voice and respected among his peers. And I hope that he will seize the opportunity to refocus the ideology about Africa to his peers and to draw their attention to the nitty-gritty details of how to, 1, prioritize the security of African people, 2, how to signify and the resource ownership and trade among themselves as a pivot dimensions, and maybe as a third dimension, it is to task the legal land friends to think of what is the future for Africa in the legal regime.
Interesting there. Many thanks, Feta Simon, for the submission and perspectives, and many thanks to you too, Jacqueline Nakaiza. I do hope that in these challenges that we are grappling with, we can find a way of doing business with Tanzania, and then we can be paid in about 5,000 wildebeests, those animals that create a lot of attention every year when they do the mass migration. We can have a bit of those animals in one of our national parks, but I don't know what we can exchange with for those animals so that Tanzania can agree to transporting some of them here. That will do it for this discussion. I hope it has emboldened your understanding of matters of non-aligned movement and, of course, what Uganda stands to gain as this summit gets underway in January. Stay with us. Morning at 10 TV does continue.